Alma Duran Merk is a social and cultural anthropologist whose research focuses on the German immigrant experience in the Yucatan. Today, we will be discussing her book, In Our Sphere of Life, German-Speaking Immigrants in Yucatan and Their Descendants, 1876 to 1914. So thank you for joining me.
Good morning, Samuel. Happy to be here.
Okay, so for the first couple questions, I typically just do like questions about the researcher themselves and then research in general, and then we get into the book. So the very first question is, how did you come into your field? What made you want to research Germans in Yucatan?
Actually, the story came to me. I was traveling with my husband. He's interested in Yucatecan ruins. So we were in the fields, in the monte, how they call it here in Yucatan. We were living in Germany to start with, okay? I stayed behind, and one of the guides, a Maya person, told me that his grandmother had been a German lady. And I thought that was quite intriguing. So that's how it started. I started asking him questions, and I asked him if he had anything that belonged to his grandmother, any objects, any stories. When I went back to Germany, I spoke to Professor Bernecke, who had written most of the literature about Germans in Mexico. And I said, well, I was told this story. Have you heard anything about it? Professor Bernecke created this term, the Handelskonquistadoren. It's so much use. So these are Germans who, because they had a certain economical position, a certain way of working, they found certain opportunities. They were able to conquer, let's say, the countries where they live. But they all came basically from the middle to upper classes. Professor Bernecke had also studied colonies from poor colonists in South America. But he said, well, I haven't heard about colonists in Mexico. And I haven't heard about a migration in the time that I was able to place it. He was very generous. He gave me some tips about where to look for lists, where to look for information. And that's how it all started. So I went with my husband, because my German was still pretty basic those days, to look for the list. And the ship list actually did show up. They were in Hamburg, and that proved that during the time of Maximilian, 2 groups of colonists were brought to Mexico, and that's how it all started. My master's thesis came from that research. And at that moment, I concentrated only on the colonists as a close group, but I realized that I had much information, and that's what became my PhD thesis, and then the book that you know.
And how did you get into the field itself? So, I mean, I'm in history, and this to me kind of reads more like a sociology book, but then you study anthropology.
Yeah, because we have to see how that is defined in Germany.
Okay.
Yeah,
So,
in Germany, it's actually anthropology is the translation that we use the most in English. In German, it is ethnologie. So it is the study of culture, but it always has a historical background. So it's a huge difference. And also there's no extreme separation between the sciences. I studied 1 year of sociology, and many of my mentors and friends are sociologists. So you can we do work with a thesis and with a hypothesis, but our interest is to understand what happens in daily life. Yeah, how the impact in culture is in that which is quotidian, and what are the factors that are creating that living experience. So you make use of different sciences. That's the difference in European ethnology, that allows you to use all these tools to explain an experience.
Okay, because you also talked about doing a lot of work in archives, and yeah. I'm like, she sounds a lot like a historian.
I am in a way. Yeah. The way it is understood is very different in the university where I graduated.
Okay, that's
Uh-huh.
interesting.
Uh-huh.
Uh, so in terms of the research, did you find like a big difference between reading maybe records in Germany, like or the historiography in Germany, how German historians talked about Germans in Mexico versus maybe how Mexican historians talked about Germans in Mexico? Were there differences in like the historiographies?
Well, to start with, the German interest in Latin America increased around the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then you have a large production of essays and studies. But definitely the focus has been on elite migration. Yeah. However, I think there's a process of deconstruction or let's say refinement, at the same time amplification of the way that we're looking at history. And then we're realizing, okay, not everyone is included in these studies that only concentrate on one specific socioeconomical group. Yeah. That impulse actually comes more from Latin America.
Mhm.
And that comes mostly as a result of very localized, smaller studies, where you really look at a group and you say, is this really a group? Are there divisions?
Mhm.
How do those divisions have repercussions? So mini studies, micro studies, very clearly geographically analyzed that allow you to see a difference. It's a different lens.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I definitely picked up that from your writing.
Mhm.
Um, what would you say was the hardest part of this research?
To puzzle it together because it was really as if you had a huge puzzle with pieces that you had no idea whether they were part of your puzzle or something else and how to locate them. So the way to go was to create a huge database.
Hmm.
Every time I ran into material that referred to a German or possible person who was related to the German community, this person will have an entry, and I will start bringing the information, classifying the information in the 4 areas that I was studying. Because I was not only interested in their economical success, I was interested in their economical failures too. And I was interested in who did they marry,
Hmm.
and did they have a clean criminal record? What happened to their religion? Did they become friends with their neighbors or not? All those things that talk about an integration in a way of belonging. So many of those entries had to be discarded at a certain point because it turns out that the person was not really German, or that the person only lived here for maybe a year, so it's not relevant for my research, because I wanted to see what happens when you are in a location long term and how that works at a family level. Yeah. So it was about creating that database, definitely, and it was very challenging. As you can see, we're talking dozens of archives, having access to family collections. I will not call them archives. I will call them collections, especially from the less privileged classes, was very rich in terms of material and knowledge, but very difficult to access.
Was there like just a little like brief question on methodology? Is there any like kind of software or how do you go about like organizing this data? So I'm going to be doing like a year of research and I'm like trying to think like, okay, how can I come
Well,
at this? Uh,
well, we're talking, when I began, remember, we're talking 2002. Okay, when I began this, dealing
mhm.
with this thing. So spreadsheet, that's what was available those days. Yeah, spreadsheet. You start doing columns and you say, okay, how am I going to be classifying this, and how am I going to keep track clearly where this source is coming from? So you create your nomenclatur. I'm thinking in German.
Nomenclature, yeah.
Yeah, okay. for your sources, and you start tracking them, What helped me also is a program, but it only runs on Mac, called DevonThink. I'm sorry to be doing advertising, but it works wonders. Okay, because it's really it's a really smart way of keeping information. You can track by word.
Okay.
So that's how I did it in those days. Maybe now you have different programs that I'm not familiar with. I hope you do. If not, you're going to be doing a spreadsheet.
So with it seems like you kind of came in with a vision for your research. But you even talked about how you had so many moving parts and like you had to kind of fit them together and figure that out. Like that was a hard part of the research. Was there any moment or any time when you were like found a source or you were talking with someone and everything really kind of clicked together for exactly like, okay, now I know what I'm trying to say. I know I'm trying to argue. Um, and which is like you're arguing against Buchanal, but like, was there any moment that crystallized everything for you?
Yeah, I can give you two examples. One of them is it took me a long time to find a model that will help me to understand the acculturation process, because there's much misinformation and misunderstandings about what acculturation means,
Mm-hmm.
the different ways in which you can interact with a society. When I found the right model, I say, yes, I can work with this. I see you can live in a country and you can be completely segregated. Yeah, you can live in a society and you can be marginalized, and this is how it's going to look. Yeah, you can integrate, and this is when I know that the person is integrated. And integration can take place in different ways. It can be that you're socially integrated, but economically not, or the other way around. So it was a model that really allowed me to be able to come to conclusions, to understand what your chances were if you were coming from a family of farmers that left what was not even Germany in those days. If you left your country and you came as a poor laborer, what were your chances that the second or the third generation was going to experience some kind of upper mobility? And what that Germanness that we speak about, which is so difficult to define, meant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because what I found is that in Mexico in those days, in Yucatan at least, the Germanness was only kept if you had money.
Mm-hmm.
If you have the means to support that Germanness and the size of a colony behind you that will support you. And that didn't exist here, which means it didn't exist in other places neither. We just haven't looked for it.
Mm-hmm.
We just haven't looked for the sources that will give us that information, look at them. So that is a moment in terms of theory that I thought I can work with this. I can explain what is going on. Are there exceptions? Of course. Is it a perfect theory? No. But it did help me to analyze in a way that was clear and I think foreseeable for others, why I come to certain conclusions. The other aspect is how to make sense of the family histories when you're talking about families who in their own language, in German, barely wrote and read. And they came into a country where they didn't speak the language and they didn't have the means to learn Spanish. And where history is seen through a lens of decades. Yeah. So many times you found records you didn't know you were talking about the same person because the names were written in such variable ways and the stories didn't make sense. But I remember one family that I thought was like 3 different families. And then one day in the archive, the church archive, in a section that is called Matrimonios Ultramarinos, a whole file showed up explaining the story. And it was beautiful. It all makes sense. And all the family histories, false histories that were built about it, just fell apart, because this is a family in which certain members of the family have cultivated this dream, let's say, that the family came with Carlota as part of the court, when in reality there were immigrants of need, you know? And this file explained everything from A to Z. So yeah, those moments happen.
Do you ever think that sometimes kind of just the momentum of a theory or a historical idea can kind of reinforce what historians are saying about it? Like, what I mean is, because Germans are always kind of so considered as upper class, then historians who come later are now reading what people say, and everyone's saying that Germans are all upper class. And then historians are writing about how Germans are all upper class. And then later historians are now reading these historians about things that people in the past had said. And it just kind of all kind of is one big circle. Um, and sometimes I wonder to what degree that can affect like oral history, like what you had just been saying, like family histories of, just because that is what everyone has said, then it kind of becomes imbued in personal stories and personal history, and the difficulty with like kind of untangling those knots.
There's definitely an influence, because that creates, let's say, a shared common knowledge. No?
Yeah.
And what I found in many families from poor immigrants is that it was embarrassing. The idea of saying, yeah, my grandmother was a seamstress or was a maid, was not very presentable in society. No? But I really hope that I've seen, actually, at least in Mexico, I've seen quite a few people who are very interested in expanding their vision, and also in putting the work that it takes, because it's lots of work to go through all those sources, and are more interested in showing a vision of society that is multiple, that is more inclusive, that doesn't go from generalizations, but it's interested in presenting diversity, yeah, and that show us the real complexity of experiences.
Did you, like, in any of the immigration records in Germany, did you find anyone who was forced to immigrate to Mexico? So I'm reading another book on Germans in America, and the author talks about how in several German cities, as industrialization is kind of taking off, you end up having certain cities kind of just make a collection to send all of their poor to the US. And so the author found kind of these records of like kind of forced immigration where people said I didn't want to leave, but they kind of kicked me out of the city because I was poor. And so I was curious, because you're also dealing with this underclass in coming to Mexico, if you found anything like that.
In the case of Villa Carlota, the emperor sent someone, Moritz von Hippel, to recruit immigrants. And it was quite challenging, because there were already warnings against migration to the ABC countries, given that some of the contracts were not being respected. And when we got to the ABC countries, they found conditions that were absolutely intolerable. What we found is records of people who felt they had no option of staying in Germany. Was no option because they were really poor. It doesn't mean that there were records saying you have to leave because you're poor, but they left because there was no option for them. And also people coming straight out of the poorhouse or with certain physical disabilities that were enlisted to live. Whether the state forced them to do that, there's no proof. But true is that the way the contract was written, what was being offered by Mexico at that moment, was very enticing. Yeah? So it depends how you describe forced migration. In modern anthropology, we think when there are conditions of poverty, when you feel you have nothing to give to the next generations, when there's people telling you whether you can marry someone or not and how to live your life, those are all considered push factors.
Mm-hmm.
The state doesn't have to come and kick you out. Your living conditions have been done so unlivable that you leave. So that's forced migration.
Okay, it's a
Mhm.
good perspective.
Yeah, and the other one is the industrialization. We're talking about an area that was in a transition from being an agriculturally based um, society to industrialization, and many people, many artisans were just not able to compete. So they were rendered obsolete and they had no way of making a living. That's, for us, is considered forced migration too.
So in the book, you talked at several points, you refer to the migrants more like Germanophone, or sometimes you'll say German speaking rather than Germans. Um, and we kind of briefly touched on the fact, well, there was no German country, so who was a German? So how did you get at this concept of Germanness? Because you also kind of tie it in with class and saying, okay, Germanness only stays, it only has staying factor uh, if the person ends up being upper class.
Mhm.
Um, so what is Germanness?
I didn't use the construct Germanness exactly in the whole book
Mm-hmm,
because it's a construct.
mm-hmm,
So the way I wanted to look at it, or what I was interested in, is who were these people, how did they live, and doing a clear list of why am I looking at, and separating. For example, separating nationality or pertinence to a state from language.
mm-hmm,
Because some people still consider themselves as a descendant of someone who came from Germany. But by the second generation, the language was gone.
mm-hmm.
So I analyzed different parameters and did not use the construct Germanness on purpose. So I speak about them as German speaking immigrants. There was no German nation, so I didn't want to use the word Germans neither. That's why I call them German speaking.
Mm-hmm. Uh, what do you think is the benefits or the detriments of doing a focus of like a region like the Yucatan versus maybe doing just one city? Like I think it was your dissertation that was much more focused on Villa Carlota, like just the one colony. And I feel like the book is a bit more expansive. It talks about also a little bit on Germans in Puebla. You're also making some comparisons between Germans in this region and Germans in other parts of Mexico. So what's the benefits of containing your study to a region, and what are the detriments?
I think we have quite a few works that deal in general with several large populations. And if we take a perspective that allows us to really look closely at one specific group, we can see this detail. We go back to this idea that I was mentioning to you a few minutes ago, no? That it allows us to see diversity.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very important, especially in a time when everything gets so polarized and when enough of those general versions have been offered.
Okay, now to the big question is, so you seem to be in this book making a big argument against uh, Buchenau and his main argument of him and others, obviously, that most German immigrants were upper class, or if they weren't, at least they came to Mexico and they kind of were able to slide into the upper classes relatively easily. They had higher levels of social mobility. In your book, you're arguing that it's bifurcated. So there were some Germans in the Yucatan who were able to move into the upper class, but the Yucatan in particular there was just a massive uh, degree of inequity with the wealth. So there's very few people on top, and then most people were at the bottom, including most Germans who ended up immigrating there. So my question is that in general, or is that also comparative? Uh, so to what degree did Germans still have higher degrees of social mobility in the Yucatan compared to the average Mexican in Yucatan, or does that dissolve by essentially the second generation um, as they end up losing ties to German associations?
Okay. First, I don't think I'm arguing against this idea of Germans belonging to the upper classes. What I'm saying is that that is part of the reality, the part that has been studied based on the documents and the experience or the interest of certain scholars. Once we start looking at other records and we open our methodology, we're going to find other indicators that tell us that basically in all the cities, probably, including Mexico, because when I look at records of the 19th century, I see that there's a lot of people also of European background that are listed in occupations that are very humble. So if we start looking at that and someone has the interest to follow those traces, you're probably going to find the same. It's a lot of work. In Yucatan, what I will say is that for the lower classes that immigrated here, the mobility was basically equal to the mobility chances of the local population. So this, let's say, bonus of being German, if there is such a thing, got dissolved pretty quickly. And this is because the social contacts, the access to education, the access to the language was gone. So it really depends a lot of what your conditions are, where you are. Yucatan had offer special chances to study this because there was a large number that came together with Villa Carlota. That's the big difference. Yeah. And that's what it allows us to really look at it. It offered that possibility.
The other thing that I thought was very surprising to me about reading this book is a lot of the Latin American historiography, the Latin American literature I'm reading, they make a big deal about race and make a big deal about blanqueamiento and like the idea of white, so many Latin American countries trying to have white immigration come. And the idea is white immigrants are more civilized or they're more cultured or whatever, and that raises the culture. But you seem to be arguing the opposite, where Germans are coming and acculturating to the Yucatan context, and a lot of other people I've read who've been writing about the region are saying pretty much the same thing. So what is race in the Yucatan? And I'm also thinking about the context of the war of the caste war of the Yucatan, which sometimes is, or in a lot of histories, is described essentially as a race war between the federal Mexican government and the local Mayan community. But I've read other books now that are a little bit more recent that are saying that race did not play as much of a factor because there were Mayans on both sides.
Right.
There was also Germans fighting on the Mayan side, and they were also kind of allied with the British. And there's like a lot of, when you actually get down to the actual records, it's a lot messier. So what is race in the Yucatan context? What do you think?
the idea of race, yes, it was very popular in the 1900s, and it was one of the motivators to bring immigrants into different countries, of course, not only Mexico, so the ABC countries. Um, the idea of the caste war as a caste war has been revised. One of the scholars that most have provided this new vision is Wolfgang Gabbert. And he has been able with documents, yeah, with documents, which is what I do in my book, with documents to show reality is much more complex than we thought. No, that's what he's been able to do. Race was always challenging in Yucatan because, to start with, only a small number of Spanish immigrants came to Yucatan. Miscegenation was given very early during the so-called colonial times. But there was no much migration from Europe. It was very limited. Here, many people didn't even have an idea about exactly what for example, these Germans meant. This migration project of bringing Germans from Maximilian actually is a project that was created by Maximilian and his people in downtown, in downtown, yes, sure, downtown, in Mexico City. The way these colonies were placed, so in the middle of a small rural village in Yucatan, the Mayas in that area, we're talking about a Maya population. There was almost no mestizo population anymore. They had no idea what a German meant. They don't even have a word for German. So what did it mean for those immigrants when they arrived? Yes, they were different, but they were seen, based on the documents found in the narrative, as people who were being protected or supported by Maximilian's empire. So a position a little bit more secure. What was interesting is what happened when they were in Merida, because there were people trying to approach the Germans, trying to buy their children. They were looking for blonde, blue-eyed children. So in some populations, yes, this idea of whiteness was present, and the idea of, yeah, the Germans will come and make the land flourish. But you see it very little in villages, which is where the Germans were placed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's like the difference between the national context and the local context. So one of the things I did actually for my research is I ended up going to Berlin last summer, and I was just going through all these newspaper archives from Mexico, just looking for references to Germans and like seeing what I kind of could figure out from there. And what I found from the data set I made, at least, was that most of the references, or a good percentage of the references, actually referenced the career or the occupation of the German, which makes sense, like, because apparently ethnicity was fairly frequently tied in with occupation. But the main occupation that was tied with Germans was not actually merchant, but a physician, medical doctor. And so I thought that was so interesting because I made a graph, and then I made it a comparison with one of the graphs you had in a research paper I wrote, kind of showing that, well, the actual occupation for a lot of Germans was merchant. The perception of Germanness in Mexican newspapers was physician, and that comes with lots of different social expectations and things like that of what it means to be German in Mexico. So I'm wondering if there's an aspect where Germanness is tied to class and that it is lost because So I'm trying to kind of get around this idea. Is it that upper class Germans create institutions such as the German schools that maintain Germanness within their community, and where that's not present, that it's lost? Or is it much more that if you're German and upper class, then maybe you're more proud of being German, and if you're a lower class, it means less? Um, I'm still trying to like kind of get
Yeah.
around that idea.
Well, first, when we're looking at sources, we always have to ask who's speaking and based on what
Mm-hmm.
experience, no? So, a newspaper owner, journalist is going to have a different perspective than someone who is living in a barrio
Mm-hmm.
and and knows that a person of German origin works taking care of the horses of this or that.
Mm-hmm.
So who's speaking and why? But of course, the creation of institutions that support some of the cultural markers of a group is crucial for the existence, for the permanence of certain markers. If you have the money to send your children to German school, of course, the children are going to speak German. If you write German and teach that to your children will. But if you yourself don't write it, how are you going to trade that? Huh? So, and the German clubs, we have to remember the role of German clubs.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, yeah. So there's series of institutions, and of course from those institutions there's social ties that are created and family expectations. So we see, for example, that in upper class Germans they will only marry Germans for a certain number of generations, but in the lower classes, no, they will marry Maya people if they were working in a hacienda, I don't know, 60 kilometers away from Merida. Who are you going to marry
Mm-hmm.
if you are a laborer?
Mm-hmm.
Whoever's there. So a Maya lady, a mestizo lady,
Mm-hmm.
you integrate where you are. And that's why I found this statement of Fernando Warby so powerful, where he talks about his experience. And he says, in our sphere of life, we share the same concerns about absolutely basic needs with the locals.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summation. So I'll just have one last question, uh, and I ask everyone this, and it's, what is one book in your field or one book that you came across in your research that you think more people should be reading?
You're gonna laugh, but it was crucial for my research. That is Erika Pani's revisit to the time of Maximilian in Mexico. I think it's very important because what we learn about history is conditioned by certain interest of ways to look at, let's say, reality during a period of time. And for many decades, the Second Empire was not seen in all its multiplicity. Let's say, yes, there were certain things that were this way, but there's also this and that. And I think Eric Capani opens our eyes to consider the empire in a different way. And that was crucial for understanding the migration of poor Germans to Mexico and Maximilian's empire.